The wind howls mercilessly across the frozen wasteland of Antarctica. Snow and ice swirl like a living entity, battering the windows of Outpost Theta, a solitary research station buried deep in the continent's hostile interior. Inside, the crew of 4 huddles in the cramped common room, the walls trembling slightly under the weight of the storm. The only light comes from a few dim bulbs swinging gently overhead, casting long, jittery shadows. Elias, the expedition leader, fiddles with the radio, his gloved hands twisting the dials. Static hisses back at him, relentless and impenetrable. He leans closer, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. Base Camp 4, this is Outpost Theta. Do you copy? Over. The response is the same as it's been for hours. Nothing. Just the empty rasp of interference. Mila, the youngest of the crew, sits on the edge of a battered chair, nervously tapping a pen against the table. The rhythmic clicking is almost drowned out by the howling wind, but it grates on Sophie's nerves. Sophie slams her hand on the table, startling Mila. Would you stop that? You're making it worse. Mila glares back but drops the pen. Worse than what? We haven't heard from Base Camp 4 all day, and we're stuck in the middle of this storm. You're telling me not to be worried. Anton, the team's grizzled veteran, leans back in his chair, sharpening his hunting knife with slow, deliberate strokes. She's got a point, he mutters, his voice low and gravelly. It's not like them to miss a check-in. And this storm, it came out of nowhere. Too fast. Too strong. Elias doesn't turn away from the radio. Storms do that out here. You know the drill. Equipment failures happen. Radios go down. Let's not jump to conclusions. He adjusts the dial again, his voice tinged with growing impatience. Base Camp 4. This is Outpost Theta. Please respond. Over. A flicker of sound emerges, just for a moment. The static shifts, becoming almost melodic, like a distorted voice. The room goes still as everyone freezes, listening. Was that? Mila whispers, leaning forward. The sound cuts out as quickly as it began, replaced by more static. Elias slams his fist on the radio in frustration. Damn it, bot. Sophie exhales sharply, her breath visible in the cold, stagnant air. It's the storm. The interference. It's always like this. We've been through worse. Mila isn't convinced. She wraps her arms around herself, her voice softer now. What if it's not just the storm? What if something happened to them? Anton leans forward, his knife forgotten on the table. If something happened, there's not a damn thing we can do about it tonight. Best we all get some rest. Elias stands, stretching, his frame imposing under his heavy parka. Anton's right. Let's call it for tonight. I'll try again in the morning. No point in sitting here driving ourselves crazy. Reluctantly, the group disperses. Mila heads to her bunk, pulling the curtain shut behind her. Sophie lingers for a moment, staring out the frosted window, but all she can see is a wall of white. She shakes her head and follows Mila. Anton stays behind, cleaning his knife methodically, while Elias powers down the equipment. As the room empties, the radio crackles faintly. A voice emerges from the static, faint but unmistakable. Help below the ISA. The sound is gone before anyone hears it. Only the radio and the howling wind remain. The radio crackles faintly in the now empty room. The voice grows clearer, distorted but unmistakable. Help below the ISA. The words hang in the air, low and drawn out, before dissolving into static. The station creaks under the weight of the storm, as if groaning in response. In her tiny bunk, Mila tosses and turns. The thin curtain separating her bed from the rest of the sleeping quarters does little to block the eerie sounds of the wind outside. She reaches for her flashlight, clicking it on. The weak beam illuminates the cramped space around her. Shelves stuffed with notebooks, old photos pinned to the wall, a few crumpled energy bar wrappers. Her hand trembles slightly as she picks up the notebook from the floor, flipping through the pages. She stops at a drawing she made earlier, a crude sketch of the ice caves they explored just days ago. The river of glowing red liquid snakes through the center of the page, its eerie luminescence captured in shaky pencil strokes. She runs her fingers over it, her eyes unfocused. A faint noise snaps her back to reality. It's coming from outside her bunk, barely audible over the storm. A slow, wet dripping sound. Mila. Sophie's voice cuts through the quiet. You awake. Mila clicks off her flashlight and peeks out from behind the curtain. Sophie is standing in the middle of the room, her face pale and drawn. Yeah, I'm up. What's wrong? Sophie hesitates, glancing toward the common room. I thought I heard something from the radio, like someone talking. Mila frowns. You mean base camp? Did Elias call again? No. Sophie's voice drops to a whisper. It wasn't base camp. It didn't sound like them. Mila's unease deepens. She climbs out of her bunk, grabbing her parka. Let's check it out, Bot. The two of them make their way down the narrow corridor toward the common room. The faint glow of the emergency lights casts an otherworldly hue over the walls. The storm outside seems louder now, almost alive. When they reach the common room, they find Anton sitting at the table, his knife in hand. He looks up as they enter. You two hear it too. Sophie nods, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. What did you hear? Voices, Anton says simply. His eyes flicker toward the radio. Clear as day, said something about the ice. Amila approaches the radio, her hand hovering over the controls. Maybe it's base camp. Maybe they're in trouble. Don't touch it, Anton warns, his voice sharp. Mila stops, looking at him. Why? What if they're trying to reach us? Anton leans forward, his expression grim. That wasn't base camp. Whatever that was, it's not them. Elias enters the room, rubbing his eyes. What's going on? Why's everyone up? Sophie turns to him, her voice rising slightly. We heard something on the radio. Voices. It sounded like they were calling for help. Elias frowns, glancing at the radio. You're sure? It could have been interference, or... It wasn't interference, Anton interrupts. It was too clear. Someone or something was talking. Elias steps forward, pressing a few buttons on the radio. The static hums softly in the background, but there's nothing else. Whatever you heard, it's gone now. Let's not get carried away. Mila shakes her head, stepping closer. We're not imagining this, Elias. First the storm, now this. Something's wrong. What if base camp's in trouble? We can't just ignore it. Elias sighs, his shoulders slumping. Even if they are, what do you expect us to do? We're cut off. The storm isn't letting up. Until morning, we're not going anywhere. The room falls into a tense silence. Then, a deep rumbling sound reverberates through the station. It's low and distant, like the earth groaning beneath them. The lights flicker. What the hell was that? Sophie asks, her voice trembling. Elias grabs a flashlight and gestures for everyone to follow him. Let's check the generator, Bart. They move as a group through the darkened corridors, the sound of their boots echoing on the metal floors. The rumbling grows louder, closer, as they approach the utility room. When Elias pushes the door open, they freeze. The walls are slick with a faint red liquid, glowing softly in the dim light. It snakes across the floor, pooling near the base of the generator. Mila takes a step back, her breath hitching. It's the same as the river. It's here. Sophie stares, her mind racing. But how? The river is miles away. This doesn't make sense. Anton steps forward, his knife in hand. Sense doesn't matter. It's here, and it's spreading. Elias kneels, inspecting the liquid. It writhes slightly, as if alive, shifting in response to the beam of his flashlight. He pulls back, his voice tight. Whatever this is, it's not natural. We need to contain it. Now. A loud crack splits the air. The floor beneath them trembles violently, and a spray of red liquid bursts from the far wall, splattering across the room. The group scrambles back, panic overtaking them. Out! Everyone out! Elias shouts, shoving the others toward the door. As they retreat, Mila glances back and freezes. For just a moment, she sees something moving within the liquid, a shadowy shape shifting and writhing. Mila! Move! Sophie grabs her arm, dragging her out of the room. The door slams shut behind them, and the rumbling ceases. The four of them stand in the hallway, breathing heavily. What the hell is happening? Mila whispers, her voice shaking. Elias grips his flashlight tightly, his jaw clenched. I don't know. But whatever that is, it's not staying contained. The radio crackles faintly in the now empty common room, breaking the silence with intermittent bursts of static. For a moment, it almost sounds like words, a faint whisper buried in the noise. Help, below the Isa. The words hang in the air, distorted and drawn out. Then, just as quickly as they came, they fade into nothingness, leaving only the storm howling outside. The station creaks under the relentless wind, as though the building itself feels the weight of something ominous pressing down. In her tiny bunk, Mila stirs restlessly. The thin curtain separating her bed from the rest of the sleeping quarters doesn't muffle the eerie wail of the wind. It's not just the noise keeping her awake, though. It's a feeling, an oppressive unease that she can't shake. She gropes for her flashlight, clicking it on. The weak beam casts harsh shadows across the cramped space. Her shelves are cluttered with notebooks, an assortment of tools, and a few battered paperbacks. Photos of her family are taped to the wall. A younger Mila standing between her parents in a sunlit park, a dog panting happily at her feet. She stares at the image, the warmth of it a stark contrast to the freezing, lifeless void outside. Her gaze drifts downward to her notebook on the floor. She picks it up and flips through the pages. Near the back, her pencil sketch of the ice caves catches her eye. The glowing red river snakes through the center of the page, the lines shaky and uneven. She runs her fingers over the drawing, her brow furrowing. The memory of that discovery lingers in her mind, the way the liquid pulsed as though alive, the strange warmth it radiated despite the sub-zero temperatures. She shakes her head, as if to dispel the thought. But then she hears it, a faint noise, barely audible over the storm, a rhythmic dripping sound, wet and deliberate. She freezes, holding her breath. Mila? Sophie's voice startles her. She peeks out from behind the curtain to see Sophie standing in the middle of the room. Her face is pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You awake?" Mila clicks off her flashlight and climbs out of her bunk. "Yeah, what's wrong?" Sophie glances toward the common room, her voice low. "I think I heard something. From the radio. It sounded like he..." She hesitates, searching for the right words. "It sounded like someone talking." Mila frowns, pulling on her parka. "Did Elias call again? Was it base camp?" Sophie shakes her head. "No, it wasn't base camp." It didn't sound like them at all, but the unease in Sophie's voice sends a shiver down Mila's spine. And it's not just the cold. She nods, grabbing a flashlight. "Let's check it out." The two of them move quietly down the narrow corridor toward the common room. The emergency lights cast an eerie red glow over the walls, making the shadows seem alive. The storm outside rages louder, as if angry at their intrusion. When they reach the common room, they find Anton sitting at the table. His knife is in his hand, the blade glinting faintly in the low light. He doesn't look up as they enter. "You heard it too, didn't you?" he says, his voice low and steady. Sophie nods, her hands clenched at her sides. "What did you hear?" Anton sets the knife down slowly, his gaze fixed on the radio. Voices. Clear as day. They said something about the ice. Mila steps closer to the radio, her fingers hovering over the controls. Maybe it was base camp. Maybe they're in trouble. "Don't touch it." Anton snaps, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. She turns to him, frowning. "Why? If they're trying to reach us, we should respond." Anton leans forward, his eyes dark and serious. "That wasn't base camp." He pauses, his words deliberate. "Whatever that was, it's not them." Before Mila can respond, Elias strides into the room, his heavy boots thudding on the floor. His hair is tousled, his face lined with exhaustion. What's going on? Why is everyone awake? Sophie turns to him, her voice rising slightly. "We heard something on the radio." Voices. It sounded like they were calling for help. Elias frowns, crossing the room to the radio. He presses a few buttons, adjusting the frequency. Static fills the air, hissing and popping. But nothing else comes through. "You're sure? It could have been interference, or the storm messing with the signal." "It wasn't interference," Anton says firmly. "It was too clear. Someone, or something, was talking." Mila shifts uneasily, glancing between the others. What if base camp's in trouble? What if they need us? Elias shakes his head, his expression grim. "We can't jump to conclusions. There's nothing we can do tonight. The storm's too strong to send a team out, and we're barely getting a signal ball. But we can't just ignore it." Mila protests. Elias places a hand on her shoulder, his voice softening. "We're not ignoring it. But we're not risking our lives on a hunch either. We'll try again in the morning." Reluctantly, Mila nods. Sophie doesn't look convinced, but she says nothing. Anton stands, slipping his knife into its sheath. "I'll stay up. Keep an ear on the radio. You all get some sleep." Elias hesitates but eventually nods. "Fine, but wake me if anything changes." As the others leave the room, the camera lingers on Anton. He sits at the table, staring at the radio with a steely determination. The static hums faintly, filling the silence. Then, just as he begins to relax, the voice returns. Faint, distorted, but unmistakable. Below the ices they wait. Anton's eyes narrow, his hand tightening around the hilt of his knife. Mila steps closer to the radio, her fingers hovering over the controls. What if it's base camp? What if they're trying to reach us? Don't touch it. Anton snaps, his voice sharp and commanding. She freezes, turning to look at him. Why not? If they're in trouble. Anton's face is grim, his eyes shadowed in the dim light. That wasn't base camp. Whatever that was, it's not them. Sophie glances uneasily between Anton and the radio. What are you saying? That it's someone else out there. I'm saying we don't know what it is. Anton replies, his voice low. And until we do, we don't answer it. The tension in the room is thick. The storm outside seems to press harder against the walls, as if trying to force its way in. The door to the corridor swings open, and Elias strides in, his boots heavy on the floor. He looks at the three of them, frowning. What's going on? Why is everyone up? Sophie gestures to the radio, her voice rising slightly. We heard something on the radio. Voices. They were calling for help. Elias steps over to the table, leaning down to inspect the radio. You're sure? Could have been interference, or the storm messing with the signal. It wasn't interference. Anton cuts in. It was clear. Someone, or something, was talking. Amila's voice trembles as she adds, they said, help below the ice. Elias stiffens at her words, his frown deepening. He presses a few buttons on the radio, adjusting the dials. Static hisses softly, but there's nothing else. The faint whine of feedback fills the room before he turns the volume down. Whatever you heard, it's gone now. Elias says firmly. We're not jumping to conclusions over a few seconds of noise. Mala's frustration boils over. Why won't you believe us? First the storm, now this. Something's wrong, Elias. What if base camp really is in trouble? Elias straightens, his expression hard. And what do you want me to do about it, Mila? Go out there in the middle of a blizzard. Get ourselves killed trying to play hero. That's not what I'm saying. Then stop. Elias snaps. We don't have enough information to make any calls right now. We'll try again in the morning, after the storm dies down. Until then, everyone needs to stay calm. Anton crosses his arms, his voice steady but cold. You think waiting is going to change anything? You think the storm is what's keeping them quiet? Elias rounds on him. Enough, Anton. I'm still in charge here, and I'm telling you, we wait. End of discussion. The room falls silent, the only sound the relentless howl of the wind outside. Mila glares at Elias but says nothing. Sophie shifts uncomfortably, glancing between them. Finally, Elias sighs and rubs his temples. Get some rest, all of you. We'll regroup in the morning. Later that night, the station is quiet, the crew confined to their bunks. Mila lies awake, staring at the ceiling of her tiny space. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind sends her heart racing. She can't shake the memory of the voice, the eerie, distorted tone, the desperation in the words. Help below the Isa. Unable to sleep. She grabs her flashlight and notebook and slips out of her bunk. She tiptoes down the corridor, the faint hum of the station's heating system, her only company. She stops outside the common room, hesitating. The red emergency lights flicker slightly, casting strange shadows. Taking a deep breath, she steps inside. The radio sits on the table, dark and silent. Mila stares at it, her pulse quickening. She knows Elias would be furious if he caught her, but she can't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut. Slowly, she reaches out and turns the radio back on. Static fills the room, loud and grating. She adjusts the dials carefully, her fingers trembling. For a moment, there's nothing but noise. Then, faintly, she hears it again. Helpsa? Her breath catches. She leans closer, turning the volume up. The below the Isa. The voice is clearer this time, though still distorted. It sounds human, but there's something wrong about it. An unnatural echo, a vibration that sends chills down her spine. Who is this? Mila whispers into the receiver. Can you hear me? Who's calling? The static grows louder, almost deafening. Then the voice comes through again, more urgent. Don't dig deeper. The radio emits a loud pop, and then silence. Mila stares at it, her heart pounding. She doesn't notice the faint sound of footsteps behind her until it's too late. Mila. Elias's voice cuts through the quiet, sharp and angry. She spins around, guilty and startled. Elias stands in the doorway, his face a mix of anger and concern. What the hell are you doing? He demands. I heard it again, she stammers. The voice. It's real, Elias. It's warning us. Elias strides into the room, his movements quick and purposeful. He grabs the radio, turning it off with a harsh twist of the dial. I told you to leave it alone. Whatever you think you're hearing, it's not real. But is real? Mila insists, her voice rising. It said, don't dig deeper. What does that mean? It has to be about the caves. The river. Elias freezes for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shakes his head. You're tired. Stressed. You're letting your imagination run wild. Get back to bed. That's an order. Mila opens her mouth to argue but stops when she sees the look in his eyes. Defeated, she nods and slips past him, back into the hallway. Elias watches her go, his jaw tight. Slowly, he turns back to the radio, his hand lingering on it. He doesn't notice the faint red glow seeping into the room from a hairline crack in the wall.